It is my great pleasure and honor to moderate this first panel after this excellent kickoff with the keynote of Maddie. My name is Łukasz Kulesa. I'm heading the Proliferation and Nuclear Policy Research Group here at TUC with PONI as one of our crown jewels. I have to say it's great to see so many of you here. There's been a very difficult choice in terms of selecting the participants. The demand has been much higher than the capacity of this particular building, but we are very happy that there is interest in developing the nuclear community and finding, which is I think one of the strong points of PONI, the linkages between the military and civilian part. But to the topic at hand, before I pass the floor to Adam, Leo, and then Molly. A couple of remarks just to get us into the context of the conversation and the aim of the conversation. And I believe that we are in an inflection point when it comes to the modalities and credibility of nuclear deterrence, and I think that I know that sometimes is a cliche that everybody talks about inflection points, but I think we right now have a situation in which a number of trends converge to force us to think much deeper and much more innovative on what effective nuclear deterrence is. New geopolitical reality with a multitude of actors in the nuclear sphere, ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine, under the cover of nuclear weapon modernization program that Rachel discussed, but also the advances in military technology, the impact of broader technological changes that the speakers in this session would touch upon. And also the broader societal and political changes, so changes in the context in which nuclear deterrence is operating. So we might be discussing about the familiar three C's of capabilities, credibility, and communication, but we need to, in a sense, rethink the way that we are dealing with assuring effective nuclear deterrence, looking at the understanding of the adversary, looking at a better understanding of our own capabilities, looking at the way in which escalation can happen and escalation management can be implemented. But I'm happy to say that we'll have excellent introductory speakers to lead us into this journey into nuclear deterrence and nuclear strategy, starting with Adam Sharon, who has been studying international relations at the University of Oxford, very much, as I understand, in the interplay between security studies and also psychology and the threat perception of the population. Previously, you also worked at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, looking specifically into the Israeli perspective, and indeed, Israel would form the core of the case study of your presentation. So, Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just to make sure it works. Okay, perfect. Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lucas, for the kind introduction. And today I will be discussing siege mentality, which is defined as trauma-driven perception of existential threat, and I'll explain how it shapes nuclear deterrence strategy. Although you'll see the Oxford logo throughout the slides, the positions and opinions expressed here are mine alone. Right, so my research asks a simple but important question. Does siege mentality influence nuclear deterrence strategy? I argue that it does in three main ways. First, siege mentality drives states that are affected by it to acquire nuclear weapons without developing a clear strategy as to how to use them. So basically, they first acquire the bomb and only then start thinking about what to do with it. I just forgot to set the timer to make sure I don't go over time. That in turn increases the risk of escalation. Second, it leads leaders to frame conventional threats as existential in nature and therefore makes them more prone to consider nuclear use. And thirdly, it leads states to view the nuclear programs of their adversaries to be existential, to constitute an existential threat and therefore also to require a preemptive solution in some cases. So this matters because some of the principal adversaries of the West, namely Iran, Russia, and North Korea, all display high levels of siege mentality. So in order for Western deterrence to be effective, it needs to account for siege mentality in its tailored approach. So the plan for today is first I'll define siege mentality, I'll explain what it means, then I'll go to my case study, which is Israel, and I'll deduce three main findings. Then I'll apply them to, as I said, to Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Then I'll derive some policy implications and conclude. Right, so what is siege mentality? Siege mentality is a concept that was developed by Daniel Bartal in Israel in the 90s, and it refers to a belief that the international community is intending to inflict great harm on one's country. Right, there are two key elements here to notice. The portion of the world that intends to inflict harm, namely much of it, and also the nature of the belief itself, which is a negative one. Second, it has three main origins. First, it follows a national trauma in most cases, so we're talking about genocide, occupation, or international sanctions. Second, possible route is domestic institutions, which by this I mean that the generation that was directly affected by the trauma codifies that trauma into domestic institutions like the education system, the political system, or the cultural avenues. And lastly, leaders can also generate siege mentality by manufacturing this sense of existential dread and vulnerability, usually to acquire political gains. Its strength is basically a function of two elements, both the size of the group that believes in it and their access to policy-making centers and the power that they wield there. In terms of its impact, again, it has two distinct impacts. First, it leads leaders and policymakers to perceive of threats to be existential and also to believe that they face them alone. And it's especially difficult to address because it functions as a cognitive bias, basically as a filter by which the country understands the world. So it actively seeks confirmation to its hypothesis that everything is negative and everyone is against it. So my case study is Israel. I chose it specifically because the independent variable, which I said the siege mentality, is at a very high level. I can get into what that means in the Q&A. And that's why it's great for theory building, basically for really understanding how it influences nuclear deterrence strategy. The method I use is process tracing, specifically the completeness standard, basically to get a real understanding of what mechanisms are involved in going from siege mentality all the way to nuclear deterrence strategy. In terms of sources and operationalization, I can speak more about these in the Q&A if anyone is interested. The main finding is that, as I said, states that are affected by siege mentality usually get weapons first and then only come up with a strategy. So in the case of Israel, the founders of the nuclear program were driven by fears of a second Holocaust, and then they launched a nuclear program, but they avoided largely coming up with a plan as to what to do with the weapons. And this changed a few weeks before the 1967 war, where the leaders of the country at the time perceived of themselves as facing an existential defeat and gave a green light to acquire, basically to assemble an improvised nuclear weapon, still with very limited theory or strategy as to what to do with it. So bottom line is that siege mentality leads leaders to focus on building the weapons, but not necessarily with a plan. The second finding is that siege mentality leads states to frame conventional threats as existential in nature, and therefore makes them more likely to consider nuclear weapons. So in Israel in 67 and in 73, the two wars were framed by the policymakers at the time to be existential in nature, invoking explicitly the Holocaust and prior destructions of Jewish efforts to create a state in Israel. And in the first case, leaders authorized an improvised device, as I said, and in the second one, there were reports that nuclear demonstration was discussed and that some of the delivery system, the Jericho 2 system specifically, was undergoing some preparation. So the bottom line here is that siege mentality influences the perception of leaders, makes them more likely to think of a certain threat to be as existential, and therefore makes them more willing to consider nuclear options in solution of them. And the last finding is that siege mentality leads leaders to frame the nuclear programs of their adversaries to be existential in nature, and therefore is requiring a preemptive solution in some cases. So when Menachem Begin, who is the person to the right, explained to President Reagan why Israel chose to strike the Iraqi nuclear site in 1981, he said that it was in order to prevent another Holocaust. And Benjamin Netanyahu invoked the same type of reasoning in explaining why Israel chose to strike Iran's nuclear sites in last June, and he's done it throughout his career. So the bottom line here is that siege mentality can lead states to frame the nuclear programs of their adversaries to be existential and therefore as deserving of a preemptive strike. Now, scholars of Iran, Russia, and North Korea not all, but some of them recognize a similar pattern, namely that these countries experienced a consequential trauma in the 20th century, and that this trauma then led much of their elites to acquire the belief that Western institutions or Western powers are hostile and dangerous, and that this in turn fed into the deterrence strategy, including the nuclear one. So in the case of Iran, Vali Nasser shows that the Iraq-Iran war had a profound influence over the psyche of Iranian leaders and led them to view Western institutions and powers as hostile, and that in turn informed much of its forward defense doctrine and also its nuclear pursuits. In the case of Russia, J.H. Michaels shows what he calls the Barbarossa syndrome or the Barbarossa complex, where Russian leaders have for decades planned for a large invasion from the West by a conventional force and have basically been hyper-fixated on this large possibility of a conventional army coming from the West. And its latest iteration is where President Putin framed the war in Ukraine as a preventative war to prevent another Operation Barbarossa from occurring. And in the case of North Korea, Bomi Kim shows that the Korean War, the Japanese occupation, have both, again, informed this negative perception of Western powers and institutions and led the northern Korean country to maintain high levels of military readiness as well as nuclear weapons. So the bottom line is that the Israeli lessons do appear to apply to these cases, and that they all these actors operate under siege mentality. Right, so 3 policy recommendations. First, trauma-driven proliferators like Iran should be addressed in the following way. Basically, leaders should address their historical fears, the ones for which they're trying to acquire the weapons in the first place, and combine them with sanctions, with calibrated sanctions. A good example of how this can be done is seen in the efforts of the Obama administration in the years leading up to the JCPOA, where Obama, on the one hand, reassured Khamenei that the US was not pursuing regime change in Iran, while also imposing sanctions in order to dissuade moderate elements within that society to stop pursuing the bomb. Second, in times of crises, besieged countries are likely to frame conventional threats as existential and then take radical actions. I think a good example of that is happened in Kherson, where President Putin viewed the possible loss of many of his soldiers as unacceptable and considered using tactical nuclear weapons. So in those type of situations, what needs to be done is to recognize these dynamics early on and then to apply direct deterrence by clarifying the consequences of such an action, whilst also appealing to third parties that have better relations with that besieged actor. So China in the case of Russia, that's how the Biden administration dealt with that. And ask them to apply pressure on the besieged country. And lastly, if, for example, Germany, Japan, or South Korea were to acquire nuclear weapons, which is a topic that's been floating around these days, it's possible that Russia and North Korea would frame such efforts to be existential because of those historical lenses. So in such cases, again, the recommendation is to monitor the way in which they frame these efforts and to prepare deterrence accordingly, and also enlist the help of countries like China, who are perceived as less hostile and threatening by these countries. Right, so to conclude, the Israeli case shows that deterrence is shaped by siege mentality, or at least nuclear deterrence, in three main ways. One is that it leads countries to acquire nuclear weapons without having a clear strategy. Second, it leads leaders to frame conventional struggles as existential. Third, it makes leaders think of the nuclear programs of their adversaries as existential, and therefore makes them more willing to consider preemption. I argue that these lessons apply to Western adversaries, such as Iran, Russia, and North Korea, given that I believe they all operate under high levels of siege mentality. And so the takeaway is that in order for Western deterrence policy to be truly effective and to avoid miscalculation, siege mentality must be accounted for in the framework of tailored nuclear deterrence. And that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Adam, and I'm sure there'll be many questions and comments. We'll get to these after all the presentations, so please note down or remember your questions to come back to this later. We'll do a little bit of reorganization within the session. So as the second speaker, we'll have Leo Keay, who is the PhD candidate in defense studies at King's College London, and his research very much touches the issue of nuclear strategy, nuclear escalation, but in the context of emerging and disruptive technology, especially the advances in AI. You also have experience as parliamentary staffer, so a little bit of the academia and practical policy experience. I understand the research that you'll be presenting today is also done in cooperation with the Heritage Foundation. So over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. So let's begin. Well, I'm going to be talking today about artificial intelligence and nuclear deterrence, and specifically looking at large language models, LLMs. Right, to begin with, evidently being an AI-based presentation, there are going to be lots of cool images, so brace yourselves. So essentially what we're looking at, we first need, in AI, it's become omnipresent in today's world, today's discourse, and we need to first define it, which is essentially, artificial intelligence. What is it? It's when a machine performs a cognitive task that normally a human executes. And so what we're looking at specifically is, the latest, the last sort of 5, 6, 10 years or so, the advances in machine learning, and what it is essentially about, it's algorithmic pattern recognition. This is, recognizing, identifying patterns over massive data sets, and the ability of machines to do this often exponentially exceeds human cognition. And so, there are plenty of applications to this in strategy, how to understand one's environment, how to understand one's adversary, and there has been, at some levels, there's been, an openness towards it. Identifying things such as the exhaustion rates, trying to anticipate how the capabilities are going to be exhausted when they need to be repaired, quite low-level operational stuff. But in terms of looking at higher-level strategic thinking, there is a lot of skepticism, both academic and in the policy world. And so the essential idea is that, machine bias, that, these are very complex, delicate, consequential decisions. And if you introduce a machine into the loop, then you risk reinforcing biases and triggering, in the case of nuclear stuff, you can see the mushroom cloud in the background, catastrophic miscalculation. And so, and you know, this has real policy outcomes because, you know, in 2024, one of the few cases where the United States and China actually agreed on something in the nuclear field was on the need to maintain human control over the decision to use nuclear weapons. That is to say, keeping the machine out of the loop, supposedly. So then briefly, so LLMs, large language models, these are the chatbots. You know, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, whatever. And so I'm focusing on them because they're very easy to use. They're also very interesting. They're very new. And so what they essentially do, as opposed to other forms of artificial intelligence, it's about natural language processing. So what large language models do, they capture how specific linguistic constructs relate to strategic actions in a manner that resembles human decision making. So if I say nuclear, you probably think of deterrence, and if based on what Adam was discussing very eloquently, if we start to say, if you sort of posit a question, this is what I began my investigation by doing, you know, asking ChatGPT or Gemini, you know, state A attacks state B, how should state B respond? If you just, you know, if you say nuclear, then it generally says something like deterrence. If you start saying existential, then it starts to think, well, maybe nuclear use. So that's essentially what we're looking at. And so why it's very useful, instead of just, you know, just me wasting my time, it's because when looking at strategic nuclear policy questions, you know, there is a rather large and rather fortunate empirical gap, because the last time nuclear weapons were used in conflict was in 1945. Beyond that, we think we have some kind of an idea of what might happen and how a nuclear conflict could transpire, but actually there is no empirical proof. So there are various ways we try to address this. You know, you have mathematical modeling, you have tabletop exercises, wargaming. But large language models, why not try them? This is another way to generate data synthetically, exploring hypothetical phenomena. And so what am I looking at? The case of limited nuclear war, theatre nuclear war, going on what I was, you know, just saying very briefly, and it's the idea that we have an assumption, ever since Bernard Brodie, the idea of nuclear arms as the absolute weapon, that they would never be used because their use in the battlefield for warfighting would prove so catastrophically destructive that there would be an irresistible escalation to an all-out strategic exchange. And so we have no empirical proof for this. This is based on an assumption about how we think that human beings would behave. And so what I'm trying to do is look at this with a specific case study, United States and China, and trying to game it out using large language models. So scenario is, year is 2030, United States and China are in a high-intensity conventional conflict over Taiwan. And so looking at the following research questions. What are the thresholds for nuclear first use? To what extent would nuclear hostilities escalate? And how could conflict termination be achieved? T1 over the brink, and which was conducted a year or two ago. And so essentially what I did was programmed Google's off-the-shelf 2.5 Gemini, and got it to, in a sort of without boring you with the intricacies of the programming arrangement, I just as in a normal, you know, war game with human players, standard format of tabletop exercises. You've got red, you've got blue, and you've got white to adjudicate. So you've got two sides, and so you can get different language models to interact with each other as multi-agent. That's the idea. You have separate AIs, all within the same model, but interacting and simulating the conflict. So and then you being AI, being computers, you run the thing hundreds of times to get some level of statistical robustness, and then you compare the results to what the war games with human participants, which were run only 15 times, what the similarities and what the differences are. So, quick little look. So in all cases, we found that there are high incidences of PRC, both across humans and LLMs. High incidences of PRC nuclear first use if an amphibious invasion of Taiwan faced an imminent defeat. What was interesting was the AIs, their loss thresholds were more specific and humans were a bit more volatile. This is to be expected because, the models, this is how they're designed. They're designed to respond to inputs from a user. And so, there would be, their thinking, though, does follow, it's not random. I mean, you can clearly follow very distinctive strategic trends. So that's the first point. Then, second point, escalation remains contained to the theatre level. So, the idea that once the Rubicon is crossed, that the apocalypse would occur. There is, there is significant reasons to doubt that, I think, to at least to question it. And so, escalation remained primarily contained to the theatre level. AIs avoided strategic exchange. And in fact, it was the humans who were the more unpredictable and the more volatile ones and who actually jumped to counter-value conflagrations, an all-out strategic exchange targeting population centres. And then there was no decisive, and similarly, there was no decisive victory for either side. Then AIs, the PRC, won by essentially escalation dominance, China deciding to go strategic first. And in the humans, it was the case of the United States prevailing by counter-escalation, essentially a sort of Pericles in the Peloponnesian War, saying, we're going to let the Spartans burn the countryside, but we will stay within the walls of Athens. And also what's interesting is briefly, is just the difference because AI moving very quickly, how the frontier models, Gemini 2.5, compared to the legacy models. And essentially, the idea is that the legacy models, they're all right to give you a very kind of basic idea because it's sort of pattern matching and keyword action, it's heuristics, basically. But actually, if you have a closer look, the frontier models, they use inference-based reasoning. And so they break down a complex task into discrete components. And so as a result, the way that the strategies they adopt, you can see that they are much more calibrated, and they respond to the changes in the strategic environment, the simulated strategic environment, in a much more nuanced way, which makes them much more interesting to work with. Next step is, as Lucas mentioned, we're working with the Heritage Foundation, going to Washington at the end of next month to run a tabletop exercise with them. And so it will be elite population sample, using various political policy expertise, military backgrounds. And so essentially what we'll be doing, using 2.5 to run the same scenario, similar format, running it hundreds of times, and then comparing the results to what the humans come up with, and then also using that human data set to optimize the LLM performance, and then we can simulate and rerun it and start adjusting the variables. And because, essentially when you've got a tabletop exercise, you can only explore. It's very, very rich, and it's a fascinating process. It's been used ever, since the early years of the Cold War, and well before that actually. But you can only ever explore one scenario. And so what's really interesting is that with the LLMs, you can explore hundreds of scenarios. You can adjust every single variable. You can look at what you can try and you can really game things out and see what really causes these dynamics to change. And so, as I say below, it's capturing the creative humans. It's not a case of replacing humans. It's about augmenting human data creation methods. And so we, you add a combination of scale, detail, and complexity, which makes this, which makes this technology really, really interesting, and very much a new frontier. So, if you're interested, I've written a sort of primer piece, "Learning to Love the Bomb," which kind of sets out the sort of whole question of theatre nuclear use and the scenarios we'll be investigating. So, do have a read, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Leo. And again, I'm sure we'll come back, especially the fascinating differences between the results in terms of escalation, approaches to escalation management and moving from conventional to theater to strategic, something that's interested to go deeper into. And finally, we move to a presentation by Molly Grace Doyle, who is a recent graduate of George Washington University, focused on international relations, but concentration on nuclear policy and including the legal aspects, the nuclear law and policy, but dealing also with nuclear deterrence, extended deterrence, and you also worked as graduate fellow at the NNSA, so also the practical experience of working with stockpile management. Molly, the floor is yours.
So first I'd like to say thank you, and thank you to UK PONI for allowing me to present. I'm going to sit down with all of you and try and make this seem like a bit of a conversation, because this issue affects all of us. But before I really get into it, I'd like to make known that opinions expressed in this presentation are thank you. Opinions expressed in this presentation are entirely my own and do not reflect the views or opinions of my employer. Through this presentation, I seek to examine the concepts of post-truth and truth decay, and how the idea of the weakening of evidence-based decision-making interacts with nuclear deterrence. So, nuclear deterrence is an inherently psychological strategy. Stability is maintained when each side perceives that the cost of a first strike outweighs any potential gain. However, perception is not static, and it is not always grounded in fact. Today, as the world enters a potential third nuclear age characterized by great power competition, technological disruptions, eroding arms control regimes, and there's a parallel phenomenon that threatens to further undermine the nuclear order: truth decay. The concept of truth decay came about when RAND researchers noticed the increasing polarization and how that was affecting policy debates. So this led them to truth decay, or the collective decline in the use of facts and evidence, and an accompanying decrease in truthful views. This trend of truth decay contributed to a post-truth environment, which refers to the diminishing role of facts in analysis in public life. You can think of truth decay as the process and post-truth as the outcome. So this presentation will move through three analytical stages. First, I'll introduce truth decay, and second, I will examine traditional information-seeking behaviors and how that interacts with truth decay. And then third, I will show how truth decay can jeopardize nuclear deterrence. And I'll finish it off by doing my best to try and provide some solutions for mitigating this challenge. Truth decay manifests through four distinct but interrelated trends that systematically undermine deterrence and evidence-based analysis. So the first of the trends is the growing disagreement over facts and expert analysis. This first trend involves increasing disputes not just about policy implications, but about basic empirical facts. Vaccine skepticism looks a lot like this. In nuclear contexts, this might manifest as disputes over established adversary capabilities or intelligence assessments. The second trend is the blurring of the line between opinion and fact. When this emerges when journalistic pieces are presented as news despite being opinion pieces, or when expert analysis becomes indistinguishable from partisan commentary. Third is the rising volume of opinion and misinformation versus fact. The third characteristic reflects sheer information overload that we're facing, where facts and data can become drowned out in all of the noise. During a nuclear crisis, this dynamic can flood decision-making processes with irrelevant or misleading information. And the final trend of truth decay is declining trust in traditional arbiters of truth. This manifests in significant drops in public confidence in government data or academia or intelligence assessments. When nuclear deterrence requires trust in complex technical assessments about nuclear surety, adversary capabilities, or escalation risks, declining trust in institutions for facts and analysis undermines the necessary expertise for sound decision-making. And as a quick caveat, I'm not concerned about skepticism. That's a healthy bit of skepticism is fine. The problem I'm trying to get at is the systematic weakening of evidence-based decision-making. In nuclear contexts, this corruption really worries me because nuclear decision-makings require the integration of highly technical knowledge with strategic judgments under extreme pressure. So when decision makers lack confidence in their information sources or when expert analysis is dismissed, the foundation for rational deterrence decision-making is jeopardized. So we live in a world that is very complicated, and we are limited creatures who cannot be rational all the time. So we've evolved to take certain shortcuts, like relying on heuristics and cognitive bias. Prominent political psychologist Robert Jervis explains this through the drunkard search analogy. And this analogy basically talks about a drunk who's searching for his keys under the lamppost, but not where the light is better, but not in the grass where he actually dropped his keys. So one of the heuristics that we use is attribution error, which is the tendency to explain others' behaviors by their personal characteristics while undermining situational factors. Another is availability heuristics, which is the tendency to overweigh easily recalled information when making decisions. When secondary analysis and opinion pieces proliferate faster than technical assessments, we gravitate towards the more readily available, but potentially distorted information. And perhaps the most problematic is confirmation bias, or the very human inclination to seek information that confirms existing beliefs. This proves especially relevant to nuclear policy under truth decay. Once a decision maker commits to a particular nuclear policy or threat assessment, cognitive dissonance will create pressures. So will create pressures so that even if they will interpret new information in ways that will already confirm their beliefs. And truth decay will amplify this by providing a plethora of alternative information sources you can pick that can verify any position. And as humans, we are the drunks in this analogy, but when this applies to decision makers, there is often the added pressure of time. And leaders are not as lucky as us, as academics, to be able to say, it depends. They have to make concrete decisions with a lot of time pressure. And so naturally they use heuristics as shortcuts to make sense of the ambiguity inherent in the system. And just like the drunk, we often search for information in places where it's easiest, or rather where truth is most likely to, rather than where truth is most likely to be found. But truth decay transforms this dynamic. Instead of searching in the darkness under a lamppost, we're now searching in a carnival of mirrors, surrounded by light and information, but a lot of it is distorted, manipulated, or deliberately misleading. One of the implications for nuclear deterrence is that nuclear deterrence depends on clear communication of threats and assurances. Truth decay can compromise signaling by making it more difficult to distinguish the sound of signals through the cacophony of noise in the environment. And third, the third trend of truth decay, the rise in volume of opinion over fact, degrades the signal-to-noise ratios as government officials' statements can compete with alternative narratives. And nuclear deterrence also depends on adversaries making accurate assessments of both capabilities and resolve. When leaders dismiss expert analysis and intelligence reports as biased or unreliable, they lose access to crucial objective assessments of both their own and their adversaries' nuclear capabilities and will. Extended deterrence requires allies and adversaries to believe that the guarantor state will fulfill their promises, which is traditionally, this has been reinforced through declarations, treaty commitments, or physical demonstrations like tripwire forces or nuclear sharing. Truth decay can complicate this foundation in several ways. In environments where factual analysis increasingly competes with opinion-driven assessments and trust in institutions declines, the interpretation of international agreements and institutions may shift. Truth decay amplifies existing tendencies for some actors to view multilateral treaties, alliances, and international institutions primarily through the lens of their immediate political context rather than for their strategic value for mutual security. And from the Allied perspective, truth decay creates parallel challenges. When Allied nations experience their own degradation in the information environment, they may struggle to distinguish genuine facts and policy from internalized rhetoric. This dynamic can trigger negativity bias or another form of confirmation bias, which is the idea that negative information it receives a disproportionate attention. And in environments flooded with alarming but potentially misleading content about guarantor reliability, allies may pursue costly edging strategies or independent nuclear programs, even when the original security guarantee is sound. So once the domain of elites, foreign policy is becoming increasingly driven by public opinion. This shift enhances the effectiveness of our democracy, but nuclear policy has not kept pace with this trend. Nuclear decision-making is, for obvious reasons, pretty opaque. But unlike other policy areas, nuclear issues receives minimal public education or accessible discussion. This leaves citizens poorly equipped to evaluate complex strategic nuclear choices. As democratic accountability expands to include nuclear decisions, truth decay threatens to fill this knowledge vacuum with misinformation rather than informed understanding. When citizens cannot distinguish authoritative nuclear analysis from partisan claims, there is a risk that nuclear weapons policy will be subjected to the same polarized dynamic that affecting other policy areas. We're already kind of witnessing this in the nuclear field itself, with the polarization between the deterrence community and the arms control community that mirrors partisan debates in the broader society. And this could undermine the bipartisan consensus and long-term strategic thinking that nuclear deterrence requires. So I would like to wrap it up very quickly with some mitigation strategies. So first, I think we need more research. This is a very new problem that is under-researched, and more research to help understand the trends of truth decay and especially how it affects deterrence. And second, governments must rebuild credibility through transparency and accountability. And third, we need education. Schools and universities could equip people with more civic education and media literacy so that they can separate fact from opinion. And on a final note, we need to engage. In times of truth decay, disengaging is really enticing. I know that living through this environment right now is very fatiguing, but disengaging only makes things worse. Citizens, experts, and policymakers must stay involved in honest discourse or misinformation will dominate.
Thank you very much.